With respect to the rule of law, the report addresses, firstly, judicial reform. Most persons the delegation met with, both from government and from civil society, raised issues related to the rule of law, in particular with respect to the criminal justice system. In 2008, ambitious and extensive legislation was passed to reform the criminal justice system, and this will be implemented over 8 years. The biggest change will establish an accusatory trial system, which is a change from the current use of the inquisitorial system from civilian law, and it's expected that this will better protect the rights of the accused. The delegation also met with the state court in Chilpancingo, Guerrero. The court in Chilpancingo provided a promising vision for improving access to justice through improvements to infrastructure, procedure, and professionalism. It showed a proposed plan to provide voluntary mediation for Indigenous peoples in their language, including human rights defenders. If implemented as shown, it will certainly provide a positive development for access to justice. In terms of legal aid, there is a 2008 to 2012 National Human Rights Program, which is the Mexican federal government's plan for human rights in the country, and it guarantees that public defenders will be provided to all criminal accused. But the delegation heard reports that lawyers working as public defenders work in very, very trying conditions at the state level with extremely low salaries and unmanageable caseloads. So what happens is that many civil society organizations, such as the Tlachinolan Human Rights Center, which I'll talk about more later, end up handling these cases on a pro bono basis. Another issue is police accountability. There's a very complicated police structure in Mexico, about 2,500 different entities in the country operating at the federal, state, and municipal levels. The delegation met with many people who expressed concern about the professionalism of some of these forces. Some of these forces have been associated with human rights abuses, including killing and torture, particularly the judicial police, who is the investigative force responsible under the authorities of various state prosecutors' offices for investigation. Investigations of human rights abuses by the police are generally carried out locally by the same police force accused of committing the abuses, which creates a perception of a lack of independence and impartiality. The perception the lack of thorough, impartial, and effective investigations by state and federal judicial police also undermines access to justice. The delegation heard of many cases where crimes were categorically not investigated. I'm going to talk about some specific instances in a couple of minutes. But on the other hand, we heard of cases where people who are clearly innocent are being arbitrarily charged and detained. One example would be the failure of authorities to investigate the rapes of 2 Maypa Indigenous women who reside in rural Guerrero. Their names are Inez Fernandez Ortega and Valentina Rosendo Cantu. They were sexually assaulted in separate incidents by members of the Mexican Armed Forces in 2002. And the state's complete failure to investigate those cases recently led to 2 very strong decisions from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that found that Mexico is not adhering to its human rights obligations. The delegation was also informed that investigators are also often asked victims for things like money for gas in order to conduct their investigation. So if this is a widespread practice, that raises serious concerns about corruption. There are also issues in Mexico with respect to pre-charge and pre-trial detention. The laws governing this are supposed to protect the rights of the accused, but there are challenges, such as a phenomenon called arraigo, which authorizes pre-charge detention up to 80 days. And the definition in the piece of legislation is that any crime associated with organized crime. And the definition of organized crime is very broad. 3 or more persons committing crimes in a permanent or repeated way can be subjected to 80 days of pre-charge detention. And the delegation heard of many cases where this authority was being abused. Prison conditions also remain a challenge. The delegation met with a prisoner of conscience named Raul Hernandez, who we'll also talk about more later, who was charged with murder and imprisoned in a small rural center called Ayutla in Guerrero. There were 5 people in his cell. He received no medical treatment, insufficient water, and the water that was brought to him by his wife was confiscated by the guards. He received inadequate food, including rotten meat, And during the early days of his detention, he was denied contact with his family, which is a violation of Mexico's obligations under Article 10 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There's also language restrictions in the criminal justice system in Mexico. Mexican law requires that translation services be provided from Spanish to indigenous languages for indigenous persons accused of crimes, but this actually isn't done in practice. Raul Hernandez, for example, when he was first arrested by the police in Guerrero, was not permitted to speak his mother tongue, and he was also denied his right to counsel. The effect of this is that indigenous defendants are engaging in proceedings in a language they don't understand. The delegation heard of reports of persons not being aware of what was happening with their case, and also of signing documents that were written in Spanish without being properly informed of the contents. Another major challenge that the delegation observed relating to the rule of law in Mexico is the use of military jurisdiction for the prosecution of human rights abuses committed by members of the military against civilians. There's a serious security problem in Mexico posed by the narcotics trade, and Mexico, as I mentioned before, is relying very heavily on the military in order to combat it. And they're relying on the military both for counter-narcotics and for counterinsurgency measures related to issues like the Chiapas uprising in the mid-90s. And this militarization has exposed the population to increased risk of human rights violations committed by members of the armed forces. The delegation heard information about human rights abuses committed by military officials, and these crimes included rape, murder, forced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and harassment. And generally, overwhelmingly, these violations go unpunished. The protection of perpetrators is achieved through the use of the military justice system for the prosecution of military personnel accused of human rights abuses. The military has been identified as committing most of the human rights abuses that took place during the Dirty War, about 100 murders and 600 forced disappearances. And the human rights organizations we met with in Mexico told us that no member of the military to date has been held to account. There have only been the 9 indictments by the Special Prosecutor's Office that I mentioned previously. And these human rights abuses are continuing today, and the local human rights organizations we met with reported to us that there were at least 50 incidents of extrajudicial execution, rape, torture, and arbitrary detention committed by Mexican military personnel between January 2007 and June 2008. The Mexican Constitution provides that military criminal jurisdiction shall be used for crimes against military discipline, which you'd think would be a fairly narrow provision, but it was broadened quite significantly by Article 57 of Mexico's Code of Military Justice, which provides a very, very wide definition of military discipline, namely faults common under federal law or common law or state law when committed by military persons in active service or in connection with acts of service. And it's defined service to include both armed service and economic service. Economic service being any service that doesn't require the use of a gun. So in practice, this brings all crimes committed by any member of the military at any time against civilians under military jurisdiction, whether it's in the course of active service or not. The Mexican Code of Military Justice allows the military to decide which cases it will investigate and which cases it will prosecute. It has chosen to investigate accusations of human rights abuses committed against civilians, and so now state and federal authorities automatically send all complaints involving active duty members of the armed forces to the Mexican Military Attorney General's office. And there is another item in Mexican law that's known as amparo. This is a legal tool in the Mexican Constitution and also in something called the amparo law, a piece of legislation. It allows for application to a federal court for legal protection and review of government action at all levels to ensure that individual rights are not violated. But amparo is only available in terms of military proceedings after the trial has ended. As I'm sure you have guessed already, most of these proceedings don't actually end up having a trial, so that time never comes. The result is that there's a very high rate of impunity in the Mexican military justice system, I mentioned before the sexual assaults of Valentina Rosendo Cantu and Inez Fernandez Ortego by military personnel who entered into their indigenous communities. The investigations in those cases were inadequate, opaque, and delinquent. No one has been held accountable. Valentina is an indigenous Maypa woman from rural Guerrero. She was a minor, aged 17, when she was raped by a group of soldiers in March of 2002. A medical center refused to provide her with medical care because it was worried about repercussions from the military. She reported the attack to civilian authorities, and it took them 2 months to determine that they didn't have jurisdiction and to refer the case to military authorities. And it was only at the end of January 2003, 10 months after the assault took place, that the military accepted jurisdiction and agreed to investigate.